The Jewish Religion, Its Influence Today, by Elizabeth Dilling. Chapter 5, Talmudic Immorality, Asininity, and Pornography, the Reprobate Mind. St. Paul, who had been a Pharisee, often bores Christians who do not know what he was arguing about, in his discourses haranguing Pharisees. But one familiar with the Talmud can appreciate his diatribe against the uncleanliness of those who change the truth of God into a lie, and professing themselves to be wise, they became fools until God gave them over to reprobate mind, being filled with all unrighteousness, fornication, and wickedness. Concepts from Romans 1:22, 25, and 28. Of the sacred Talmudic teachings of the sages, preserved since 500 AD and taught more widely today than ever before in Talmud Torah schools in the USA, perhaps nothing better illustrates fools with reprobate minds than the teaching in the Talmud book of Yevamot. That spittle on the top of the bed curtain proves that a wife has been guilty of adultery, as only lying down face upwards could she have spit upon it. Spitting several feet straight up. The Talmud states, quote, when a peddler leaves a house and the woman within is fastening her sinner, her breathcloth, if spittle is found on the upper part of the curtained bed, she must, said Rabbi, go. Footnote. Even if there were no witnesses that misconduct took place, further footnote, only the woman lying face upwards could have spat on the spot. Intercourse may therefore be suspected. Title: From a Roof. The Talmud book of Yevamot also concerns the duty to marry a brother's widow who is childless. 2 volumes of junk and obscenity for its own sake carry the title Yevamot. Another illustration of the reprobate mind is the teaching that Yevamot 54a, if a man falls from a roof, and his fall resulted in accidental insertion, as Yevamot 54a footnote, when in a state of erection, the lever fell from a raised bench upon his sister-in-law, who happened to be below. End quote. Here the great Talmudic saint, Rashi, is cited as authority. Quote, his commentary on the Talmud is a consummate masterpiece, a remarkable and gigantic work, end quote, says the 1943 Universal Jewish Encyclopedia. Rashi was born in Troyes, France, 1040, and died there in 1105. The above Talmud passage is not reproduced here. It is in Yevamot 53b through 54a, and on page 356 in the Sansano edition, and continues the above with the responsibility of a levir or brother-in-law. Quote, when, for instance, his intention was intercourse with his wife, and his sister-in-law seized him, and he cohabited with her, end quote. The passage is merely an excuse to indulge the reprobate mind in uncleanliness. Romans 1:28, is it any wonder that Christ likened Pharisees to unseen graves in Luke 11, and whited sepulchres in Matthew 23. Title: Bestiality. Although Moses commanded that if a woman have intercourse with a beast, both should be killed, Leviticus 20:16, and that a priest must not marry a harlot or woman who is profane, Leviticus 21:7, the Talmud teaches that, quote, unnatural intercourse does not cause a woman to be forbidden to marry a high priest. Since then, you will find no woman eligible, end quote, from the Talmud book of Yevamot, folios 59a through 59b. Rulings of the sages follow, quote, a woman who had intercourse with a beast is eligible to marry a priest, even a high priest, end of quote, unless specifically warned in advance, and the act seen by 2 witnesses. She is acceptable also. If she had intercourse with a dog while sweeping the floor, she is likewise reckoned to be pure and suitable. For, quote, the result of such intercourse being regarded as a mere wound, and the opinion that does not regard an accidentally injured hymen as a disqualification, does not regard such as intercourse either, end quote. This alone gives a fair idea of the systematic deformation of Scripture by the Pharisees and the truthfulness of Christ's denunciations about their making God's commandments of none effect by their tradition. Matthew 15:6. Title: Babies. Baby boys may always be used as subjects for sodomy by grown men, according to the Talmud. The Pharisaic subterfuge here is that until a child reaches sexual maturity capable of sexual intercourse, he or she does not rank as a person. Hence, biblical laws against sodomy or pedestry, more commonly known as pedophilia, do not apply. Throughout the Talmud, 9 years and 1 day is the fictitious age of male maturity. Likewise, under 9 years and 1 day, the first stage of intercourse of a boy with the mother or any grown woman is harmless, Talmudically. Shammai, to seem more strict, lowers the age to 8 years in some cases. See Exhibit 82 for Sanhedrin 69b of the Talmud. A long harnague about the amount of the ketubah, payment if divorced, a woman gets if her virginity was removed by a young boy, fills Kethuboth 11b of the Talmud. And here the foul mother may be reckoned pure, depending on the age of the child. Such degrading use of children was typical of paganism throughout the ancient world. Quote, when a grown-up man has intercourse with a little girl, it is nothing. For when the girl is less than this, that is, less than 3 years old, it is as if one puts the finger into the eye. Tears come to the eye again and again. So does virginity come back to the little girl under 3 years. This is found in Kethuboth 11b of the Talmud. This is the standard doctrine of the whole Talmud on baby girls. Sodomy and intercourse with babies is the prerogative of the adult Talmudic man, in contrast to Christ's beautiful teachings concerning little children. The following is also typical concerning the fictitious age of sexual maturity of baby girls set by the Pharisee sages. A maiden aged 3 years and 1 day may be acquired in marriage by coition. Baby girls of 3 can invoke sadistic punishments on those who have intercourse with them when they are nidas, also known as menstruating. A physical impossibility, of course. This can be found in the Sanhedrin Talmud 55b and Sanhedrin 69a. And at 3, a baby girl is always rated as one who is fit for cohabitation. That is, one who has attained the age of 3 years and 1 day. Found in Talmud Yebammoth 60b. But in the case of a baby girl who is not Jewish-born or so-called proselyte, she may be married, thus by a grown priest. A proselyte who is under the age of 3 years and 1 day is permitted to marry a priest, although one who is fit for cohabitation, as stated on the same page. Quote, one who has attained the age of 3 years in 1 day, end quote. This Talmud Yevamot passage continues with the ruling in the case of a baby under 3 married to a grown man priest and declared eligible to continue as his wife. The baby girl was a proselyte, of course, so age did not matter. But under 11 years and 1 day, a little girl carries on her marital intercourse in the usual manner, found in Yebamoth 12b of the Talmud. Adultery is permitted with the wife of a minor and wife of a non-Jew. The pretense is that a minor not being a man yet, and the non-Jew having non-human status, Talmudically, the biblical law does not apply. Thus, once again, do the Pharisees make the commandments of God of none effect, as Christ said. This can be backed through Matthew 15:6 and Mark 7:13. Title: Incest. Moses ordered the priests that, quote, in Leviticus 21:7, they shall not take a wife that is a whore or profane, for he is holy unto his God. End quote. The laws against incest are most vehement. Quote, Leviticus 18:7, the nakedness of thy mother shalt thou not uncover. She is thy mother. End quote. And in the Talmud, the Pharisee sages reverse these biblical injunctions. Quote, if a woman sported lewdly with her young son, a minor, and he committed the first stage of cohabitation with her, Beth Shammai say, he thereby renders her unfit to the priesthood. Here, a footnote explains that she cannot marry a priest. If this made her profane in the above Leviticus 21:7 is cited precisely. We then learn that the dispute concerns only the age of the son, not the lewdness and the foul mother. Quote, all agree that the connection of a boy aged 9 years and 1 day is a real connection, whilst that of one less than 8 years is not. Footnote. So that if he was 9 years and 1 day more, Beth Hillel agree that she is invalidated from the priesthood, whilst if she was less than 8, Beth Shammai agree that she is not. Here silliness reigns supreme, and one understands why Christ called the Pharisees fools and blind. Beth Shammai maintaining we must base our ruling on the earlier generations. The supposition that boys became fathers at 8 is the silly excuse for the Shammai school to argue that the boy must be under 8 to leave the mother pure. The standard throughout the Jewish Talmud is that a little boy becomes a person sexually mature at 9 years and 1 day. Another Asininity. The whole argument strains that the gnat of an age and swallows the camel of incest between mother and son. Matthew 23:24. Title: Incest with Lot. The Bible tells us that after the destruction of Sodom with all of its inhabitants except Lot and his 2 daughters who took refuge in a cave, quote, the firstborn said unto the younger, our father is old, and there is not a man in the earth to come in unto us. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, that we may preserve the seed of our father. And they made their father drink wine that night. And the firstborn went in, and lay with her father. And he perceived not when she lay down, nor when she arose. End quote. The next night, the same events took place for the younger. Quote, thus were both the daughters of Lot with child by their father. Found in Genesis 19:31-8. The abominating tribes of Moabiteg and Ammonites were the products of these 2 sons. at first spared, then demolished by the fourth king of Judah, Jehoshaphat, 11 Chronicles 20. But the Talmudic sages take anything but a critical view of this incest. Quote, a man should always be as alert as possible to perform a precept, for as a reward for anticipating the younger by one night, the elder daughter of Lot was privileged to appear in the genealogical record of the royal household of Israel 4 generations earlier. This can be found in Nazir 23b through 24a of the Talmud. Title: Nieces. The Jewish press in 1954 reported attempts to alter state laws so as to legalize marriages between uncle and niece, which is common in rabbinical circles. The Bible prohibits marriages between uncles and aunts and with nieces and nephews as incest. This is found in Leviticus 18:13 and 14. Under Talmudic eugenics in Barron's A Social and Religious History of the Jews, Jewish Publication Society of 1952, is this on incest. Quote, in Egypt, though the Ptolemaic, I'll repeat that, in Egypt, the Ptolemaic rulers themselves, for the most part, married their own sisters. In Parthia, Persia, marriages between parents and children were valid, and those among brothers and sisters were quite customary. The Parsi religion encouraged such marriages as the fittest means of preserving family purity. Artaxerxes, 11, had married his 2 daughters, and Mithridates, I had married his mother. Ardeavirus is said to have married his 7 sisters. Page 229, volume 11. This was not harmful, we are told. On one point, particularly, Roman law differed from Jewish: marriages between an uncle and a niece. We recall that both Rabbi Eliezer and Abba married nieces, as did Rabbi Jose the Galilean. Rabbi Ishmael made a special effort to overrule his vow not to marry his own niece, and to make the niece more attractive to him by improving her teeth. End quote. Moses commanded in God's name that a woman should not marry her uncle, or a man his aunt. Leviticus 18:14. Nevertheless, today these people of the book are striving to modify American state laws against such marriages, and have actually been successful in some states on the ground that their religion requires such latitude. Title: Harlots and Dogs. The creative powers were worshipped in all ancient pagan countries as the procreative powers of male and female, with sex rights to match. Men who became priests to the female goddess Venus, Mylitta, Astarte, or by whatever name, in a wild orgy of drugged frenzy, would castrate themselves with sacred swords, and then contribute part of their earnings as sodomists to the upkeep of the pagan cult and temple, and would train, sell, and rent dogs for immoral purposes. Girls who became priestesses to the pagan temples earned their keep and contributed to a cult's upkeep through their earnings as sacred prostitutes. But Moses taught that the worship of God was not to be maintained on such earnings. Quote from Deuteronomy 23:18. Thou shalt not bring the hire of a whore, or the price of a dog, into the house of the Lord thy God by any vow, for even both of these are abomination unto thy Lord thy God. End quote. The Talmud, citing Deuteronomy 23:19, makes this out of the ruling. Quote, there is not adultery in connection with an animal, because it is written, thou shalt not bring the hire of a harlot or the wages of a dog, etc. And it has been taught The hire of a dog and the wages of a harlot are permissible, as it is said, even both of these are an abomination unto the Lord. The two specified in the text are abominations, but not four. Then the permission is given to use for the temple. Money given by a man to a harlot to associate with his dog. Such an association is not legal adultery. If a man had a female slave who was a harlot and he exchanged her for an animal, it could be offered. End quote. Found in Sotah 26b of the Talmud. Obadiah Zara of the Talmud takes up this same matter of a harlot's hire, which is permitted, to be devoted to the temple in spite of the law of Deuteronomy 23:19. The man is permitted to do this, quote, if he gave her the money, and subsequently had intercourse with her, or had intercourse with her and subsequently gave it to her, the hire is permitted. The two matters are regarded as separate, and what she received is legally a gift. End quote. This argument goes on for 2 pages. No wonder that Christ charged that the Pharisees nullified the commandments of God by their tradition, which now is written form, has become the Talmud. Title: Permissible Adultery and Intercourse with the Dead. Quote from Leviticus 18:6. None of you shall approach to any that is near of kin to him, to uncover their nakedness. I am the Lord, says the book Leviticus 18:6. Scripture references are also cited with denounce a married woman who lies carnally with a man, not her husband. But say the sages, quote, that in connection with a married woman excludes intercourse with a relaxed membrum, since no fertilization can possibly result. This is a satisfactory interpretation in accordance with the view of him who maintains that if one cohabitated with forbidden relatives with relaxed membrum, he is exonerated. End quote. And other Talmud sources are cited. The exclusion is rather that of intercourse with a dead woman, even though she died as a married woman. End quote. Thus one is exonerated for or permitted intercourse with dead relatives, or with relatives, married or single, with a relaxed membrum, because no fertilization can possibly result. This is found in Yebamoth 55b. Intercourse with dead bodies was an old pagan practice. The above is echoed with some variation in the chief repository of the criminal law of the Talmud, the Book of Sanhedrin. There the act of sodomy with one suffering with an incurable disease, hence regarded as already dead, or a terapha, is held to be merely as one who abuses a dead person, and hence exempt. The explanation, which continues on the next page, is, quote, punishment is generally imposed because of the forbidden pleasure derived, whereas there is no sexual gratification in abusing the dead. How apt it was when Christ called the Talmudic Pharisees whited sepulchres, full of all uncleanliness, in Matthew 23. Yet some of his followers call these abominators of every decency God's chosen people and people of the book. Title: Polygamy. There is nothing now, as formerly in Talmudic doctrine, against polygamy. It is practiced by Jews in countries where it is allowed. A 1952 book by Salo Whittemere Barron, professor of Jewish history, literature and institutions of the Miller Foundation, Columbia University, is entitled A Social and Religious History of the Jews, and is published by the American Jewish Committee's Jewish Publication Society of America. The chapter, The World of the Talmud, cites the harem of King Solomon, which finished him morally and otherwise, saying its memory kindled the imagination of polygamous Jews in subsequent ages. Although we are told that there was no real difference between Palestinian and Babylonian Jewries fundamentally, the book states, quote, there are indications that Babylonian Jewish society had more polygamous features than did that of Palestinian. And anecdotes like those current in regard to Rab and Rabbi Nahum, who, after arriving in a foreign city, they used to advertise for women ready to marry them for the time of their sojourn. In law, too, the Babylonian emphasis lay upon the Jew's right to marry as many wives as he is able to support. It was Rabbi Gershon ben Judah, whose edicts were accepted by European Jewry as final for all time, who commanded Jews in Christian countries to stop getting into trouble with the law by polygamy. Israel first proposed extra allowances for plural wives, but now seems to be screening polygamy for Christian eyes. After the period of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and before this, in the case of Adam and Noah, monogamy ruled. The prophets were monogamous. Moses commanded regarding a man of God that neither shall he multiply wives to himself, that his heart turn not away, in Deuteronomy 17:17. And admittedly, the polygamy of David and his son Solomon ended the Israel 12-tribe United Kingdom. Their hordes of pagan wives and foul pagan altars broke down any godly spirit which had formerly united them. However, reversing the Bible, once again, Pharisee sages embroider upon the above words of Moses against polygamy their permission to have 18, 24, or 48 wives, found in the Talmud Sanhedrin 20b through 21a. The Mishnah asks, quote, why then is it written, neither shall he multiply wives to himself? Rabbi Simeon said, he must not marry even one who may turn away his heart, from which might be inferred that he may marry a lesser number, even if they should corrupt him. End quote. Title: The Jewish Talmud and Legally Murdering Your Neighbor. As noted elsewhere, regarding murder of the non-Jew, it is good and meritorious, providing you do not get caught and thus get Talmudic religion exposed for what it is. However, permissible murder in Judaism embraces more than just killing Gentiles. Murder by suffocation is permissible. Here, shyster hair-splitting is inserted in the Talmud, it being permissible to seal up a neighbor in an airtight alabaster chamber, providing one does not put in a lighted candle to eat up the oxygen, but merely allowing the victim to expire by breathing the oxygen up himself unaided. This is acceptable, from Sanhedrin 77a through 77b of the Talmud. Under Talmudic law, other forms of murder are also permissible. Binding up your neighbor so that he dies of starvation. Just blind up the neighbor before it is hot or cold enough to kill him, and all is well. You are guiltless of what follows. Binding up your neighbor so that he dies of sunstroke. Binding up your neighbor so that he dies of cold. Binding up your neighbor so that a lion may kill him. He could not have fought the lion anyway, so it is acceptable, says the Talmud. Letting mosquitoes bite your neighbor to death. As for the mosquitoes, they come and go. So, since the ones which bit him when you tied the victim go away, and others end his life, you are pure and blameless. Throwing your neighbor into a pit and leaving him to die there. Killing your neighbor with arrow wounds. Shooting the neighbor with an arrow is acceptable, since if there is balsam for sale somewhere, he presumably could have sent for some and thus have been cured instead of dying. These references can be found through Exhibit 85 and Exhibit 86. You can also drown your neighbor and yet be guiltless of his death. Remember to follow Talmudic law, however, and cause the water to travel a little distance before it drowns the neighbor. Then you are guiltless of his death. Title: 10 innocent is in quotations, murders. It is granted in the Talmud that the Bible forbids taking a man's life, but that merely means taking his life all by yourself. In other words, you must not take the whole of his life all alone, which permits you, nevertheless, to help 9 other men to take a life. Thus, it is stated in the Talmud, if 10 men smote a man with 10 staves, whether simultaneously or successively, and he died, they are exempt. Answering the rabbi who suggests that killing whatever is left of a man's life might be wrong, we are also told, quote, if 10 men assailed him successfully, he was already nearly dead when the last smote him. Therefore, the last 2 is exempt. End quote. Title: Mercy Killings Approved. Elaborate pains were taken rather recently by rabbis to deny that mercy killings are permitted in Judaism, because they are. The public discussion was on whether or not a hopelessly sick person should be out of his misery. The rabbis denied that would be a proper, necessarily knowing that the Talmud states otherwise. The Talmud Sanhedrin 77b through 78a contains these rabbinical edicts. Quote, both agree that if he killed a terafah, explained as a person suffering from some fatal organic disease, recovery from which is impossible, he is exempt. And if one kills a terafah, he is exempt, whilst if a terafah committed murder, if in the presence of a Beth Din, i.e. Talmudic law court, he is liable. Otherwise, he is exempt. End quote. Title: Cursing and Striking Parents. Quote, honor thy father and thy mother. So states the commandment. The Bible, through Moses, teaches that anyone who strikes or curses his parents is worthy of death. But the Pharisee sages have nullified that. One may strike parents without wounding them while they are alive, but there are no limitations upon striking them after death. Jews may curse their parents providing they use any term meaning God. Accepted are the YHWH consonants of the word Jehovah, called the Tetragrammaton, and which is reserved for use in summoning demons. As for the sacredness of the Tetragrammaton, word for Jehovah, the word God is frequently written G-D. The Tetragrammaton, written in full, is reserved for the use of rabbinical potentates, the Hasidist Baal Mastershem of the name of God, who by using 14, 42, 72 letter combinations of the name is supposedly able to invoke spirits. At the beginning of the century, according to authorities, about half of Jewry was Hasidist. The word God is not supposed to be written or spoken even today. Even the California Jewish Voice, for example, carries articles in which the word is spelled G-D throughout. Not piety, but sheer superstition governs this. One of Christ's major crimes was that he pronounced the name as spelled. It is there explained in a footnote that bless is used in the text instead of the right term curse, typifying Talmudic double talk. Moses said that anyone who cursed or struck mother or father should be put to death, found in Exodus 21:15 and 17, Leviticus 20 and 9, and Deuteronomy 27 and 16. But ye say, if a man shall say to his father or mother, it is Corban, that is to say a gift, or I have dedicated to God that which would relieve your need, ye suffer him no more to do aught for his father or his mother, making the word of God of none effect through your tradition, which ye have delivered, and many such like things ye do. End quote. Mark 7:1-13, Matthew 15. In Matthew 13 and Mark 7, Christ asked the Pharisees, why do ye also transgress the commandment of God by your tradition? For God commanded, saying, honor thy father and thy mother, and he that curseth father or mother, let him die the death. Then Christ reminded them of the Pharisee custom of dedicating their goods to the temple, then telling their needy parents that what they might have given them is now the property of God, and they must do without, although they themselves went on using the proceeds of their wealth for themselves. Christ was hated by the pagan Pharisees for such teachings as, quote, Matthew 5:17-20, think not that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill. Whosoever therefore shall break one of the least commandments, and shall teach men, so he shall be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But whosoever shall do and teach them, the same shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Except your righteousness shall exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, ye shall in no case enter the kingdom of heaven. End quote. Title: The Talmud Book of Gittin and Some Health Remedies. This Talmud book is about divorce. Reproduced herein are the title page and part of the introduction. The book also deals with the fate of Christians in hell. Following are also various dog and dung health remedies. Folio 69A-70B, devoted to these dung and dog remedies, almost too fantastic to believe. The privy, demons, and privates are mingled in insane array. The funny thing about the horrendous and silly remedies of the Talmud Book of Gittin is not the Asininity of the remedies themselves so much as the commentary in English by a British doctor with a string of alleged degrees, which appears in the appendix to the Sonsino edition of this Talmud book. He actually attempts to justify and praise these nutty things. The wrong people, it is often said, are in asylums. The appendix is entitled Notes on the Various Remedies Recommended in Folio 68B-70B by W.M. Fieldman, M.D. For the charms, amulets, incantations, astrological associations, he finds the benefit of suggestion with profound effect, and for whatever, he cannot evolve a rational physical basis. He invents imagined benefits. He points out that animal excrements as remedial agents are ancient, and we shall not lightly dismiss the ancient folk remedies, however absurd they may appear. He extols the incantations and lauds these rabbis' knowledge of all parts of theoretical and practical medicine, in which they surpassed their contemporaries. He referred to several works to study the glories of Talmudic medicine in 5 pages of whitewash, professing to look down upon the probable sneers of the sophisticated but untortured reader. which should include just about everyone except a Talmudist zealot. He refers to several works to study the glories of Talmudic medicine in 5 pages of whitewash, professing to look down upon the probable sneers of the sophisticated but untutored reader, which should include just about everyone except a Talmudist zealot. Title: Use of the Bible for Asininity and Obscenity. One is enlightened as to Christ's denunciations of the Pharisees as fools and blind in Matthew 23 by the following so-called wisdom of the sages. Adam's words about Eve are cited in the Bible. Quote, "And Adam said, 'This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh.'" A statement Christ used in his teachings about marriage in Matthew 19:3-6. But the Jewish Talmud teaches, quote, "What is meant by the scriptural text, 'This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh'," they quote Genesis 2:23. This teaches that Adam had intercourse with every beast and animal, but found no satisfaction until he cohabited with Eve. This is Yevamot 63a of the Talmud. David's 6th psalm is a plea by David for forgiveness. Quote, "Return, O Lord, deliver my soul. O save me from thy mercy's sake. In the grave who shall give thee thanks?" End quote. It continues, "I am weary with my groaning. All the night make I my bed to swim. I water my couch with my tears." Citing the above verse, Psalm 6:7, the Talmud sages make this to be the meaning. Quote, "Even during David's illness, he fulfilled the conjugal rights of his 18 wives, as it is written, 'I am weary with my groaning. All the night make I my bed to swim. I water my couch with my tears.'" This is found in Sanhedrin 107a of the Talmud. Women who are unclean, menstruating, are to remain separate, says Moses, all the days of her issue. And this verse in Leviticus 15:26 is cited in the Jewish Talmud, which states that a woman is not regarded as a Saba, which means one with a discharge, except during the daytime, because it is written all the days of her issue, from the books Horioth 4a of the Talmud. Typical of the Talmud misuse of the Bible for purposes of inventing obscenity and then giving it a biblical coding is the biblical account about Sisera, head of the Canaanite army, who fights all day and is the only man left alive. He flees to the tent of a supposed friend of the Canaanites, Heber the Kenite, Jael, Heber's wife, welcomes him in, but as soon as he falls into exhausted sleep, drives a tent nail through his temple, and he dies. She boasts of this to his pursuing captors. Next, Deborah makes up a song of rejoicing, in which she embroiders on Sisera's actual death in his sleep. Judges 4:2-1. And with poetic license sings, when she had stricken through his temples, at her feet he bowed, he fell, he lay down. At her feet he bowed, he fell where he bowed. There he fell down dead. Judges 5:27. The verbs bowed and fell are used 3 times each, and lay is used once. This makes 7 verbs used in this verse. The standard Talmud use of this verse is to indicate it as meaning 7 sexual connections. The same biblical verse is used thus about Christ. The words, "At her feet he bowed, he fell," are explained as Judges 5:27. This is taken to refer to sexual intercourse, found in Sanhedrin 105a through b of the Talmud. This is rehashed in Yevamot 103a through 103b of the Jewish Talmud. Quote, that profligate Sisera had 7 sexual connections on that day, for it is said,
Between her feet he sunk, he fell, he lay. At her feet he sunk, he fell. Where he sunk, there he fell down dead. With the footnote giving the Talmudic reasoning. Each of the expressions he sunk, he fell, occurs 3 times, and he lay occurs once. The Talmud book of Nazir reiterates the same biblical uses for no reason whatever. Quote, that wicked wretch Sisera had 7-fold intercourse with Jael at the time, as it says. At her feet he sunk, he fell, he lay, etc. The words he sunk, he fell occur 3 times, and the words he lay once. Found in the book Nazir 23b of the Talmud. The Talmud book of Horioth repeats the same obscenity. Title: Farming is inferior for Jews. In the course of a terrible prophecy against Tyre, the New York of the ancient world, and reprobate with sodomy, lesbianism, child burning, and other abominations, is a Bible verse foretelling that all that handle the oar, the mariners, and the pilots of the sea shall come down from their ships. They shall stand upon the land. This is Ezekiel 27:29. The prophecy, including all the details of the preceding chapter, were literally fulfilled by Nebuchadnezzar and Alexander the Great. Nebuchadnezzar pounded down the walls of Tyre, and Alexander made a causeway of the rocks, killing or selling into slavery the inhabitants, who had taken refuge on an island offshore. However, the Talmud nullifies and twists these biblical words, and out of the words foretelling the end of the sea-going trading power coming down from their ships, they shall stand upon the land. The Pharisee Talmud sages state, quote, no occupation is inferior to that of agricultural labor, for it is said, they shall come down. This is from Yevamot 63a of the Talmud. Title: Talmud Instructions for the Sabbath. No Talmud book illustrates Christ's depictions of the Pharisaism better than the book of Sabbath. He said in Matthew 23:24, ye blind guides, which strain at a gnat and swallow a camel. End quote. One way to go raving crazy is to study the Talmud book of the Sabbath, with its rules on what is or what is not permissible on the Sabbath. Concerning the Sabbath, even the digested laws, or Talmud Mishnah, is the Shulchan Aruch. Take up to 82 pages of Volume 2, pages 63 through 145. The sum and substance of all of them is a game of subversion, a rule to set up. How many ways are there to get around it and nullify it? That is the problem, leading to almost endless trivia and discussion. Title: Moving a door key. One gem concerns the weighty problem of the door key, which the Shabbos or Goy, or a Sabbath Gentile, is carrying home for you, so that the Jew is spared that labor. The Talmud rule is that you cannot move goods from one category of property to another, from private to public property, or from what is neither public or private on the Sabbath. Your doorstep is neither public nor private. The street or sidewalk outside the doorstep is public. Your house inside is private. Therefore, says the Talmud, you must have the goy not only insert your key in the lock, but push the door in as otherwise. If you push the door in with the key in it, you would be moving the key from property neither public nor private to the inside of the house. Title: The Sabbath Louse Hunt. Quote, one who searches his garments and finds a louse shall not crack it, but simply rub it with his fingers and throw it away on the Sabbath. Throwing away lice is not labor. Cracking a louse is to be avoided at all costs, however. Title: Sabbath Intercourse. The bloody, the sadistic, and the obscene are the darlings of the Talmudic synagogue of Satan mentality, the appetite for which is seemingly never sated. To illustrate, 8 running pages have been reproduced here, on the popular Talmud subjects of blood and intercourse. This discourse concerns whether or not the first intercourse on the Sabbath would constitute Sabbath labor. Is it performed to see if she was a virgin? A discussed length, for example. But the rule which governs is the dominant Talmud rule of the Sabbath on the subject of labor, namely, that an act of injury never ranks as labor. So if the intent is to injure the wife, an act is permissible. This is found in the book of Kethuboth 5b through 6a. The 8th page ends with the thought that intercourse is permitted anyway. Then a new line of needless, senseless, religious discussions about women and blood starts in. These long-winded, silly pages of Pharisee wisdom are but a sample of the bent of the whole Talmud. See Exhibit 121 through 141. Title: Vows. In Matthew 5:34 through 6 and Matthew 23:16 through 22 are recorded the lambastings Christ gave the Pharisee for vowings. Quote, "Ye blind guides which say, Whosoever shall swear by the temple, it is nothing, but whosoever sweareth by the gift that is upon it he is guilty. Ye fools and blind, for which is greater, the gift or the altar that sanctified the gift?" End quote. Christ goes on to illustrate Pharisee silliness. Do not swear by anything is the gist of the Matthew 5:34 passage. Not by your head, for you cannot. Make one hair white or black. One can only appreciate his words after reading hundreds of pages of drivel about vows in the Talmud books of Nazir and Nadarim. The Talmud Mishnah on the heifer and the door is illustrative. The Mishnah opens with the door saying if the man doesn't open it, and the heifer saying if the man does not make it stand up, he must be a Nazir. A Nazirite, to vow, was one who had vowed not to cut his hair or drink or eat any product of the grape for a certain time. 3 pages of haranguing Gemara following the Talmud Mishnah discusses the fact that heifer then got up of its own violation. The door is quiet, apparently, for nothing more is said by it. The Jewish school of Shammai holds that since the man did not of his own power force the heifer up, he must be a Nazir. But the Hillel Jews say that the essence of the vow is the upping of the heifer, which was recumbent and is now standing up. So the man does not have to be a Nazir. The schools of the Hillel and Shammai were in full flower in the Holy Land when Christ lived, and no doubt this and other nonsense, presently preserved for the Jewish religion, existed then. Title: Talmud, Juvenile Birth Control, and the 2 hairs test for puberty. The Talmud, Yevamot 12b, harangues about the ages when female birth control may be exercised, namely from age of 11 years and 1 day until age of 12 years and 1 day, with a child under or over these ages to carry on her marital intercourse in the usual manner. The recommended birth control is to be followed because otherwise the pregnant female might have a second conception, which would make her fetus a sandal or a flatfish. Read the asinine harangue in the Talmud, Yevamot 12b 13a, about 2 hairs proving puberty or not proving it, as the child may have lost the 2 hairs through childbirth. Also, the calling for an examination by the rabbis. The Sansino edition of the Talmud reference is made to 3 similar messes of muck in Kethuboth 36a, Baba Bothra 156a, and Nidda 52a of the Talmud. To be unable to tell whether a little girl is as yet adolescent or has borne a child or not by counting 2 pubic hairs is too idiotic to credit anything except the Talmudic love of subsewer subjects, the reprobate mind, as Paul called it, who changed the truth of God into a lie. Romans 1:25-28. To deal in unnatural filth and sex matters is the core of Talmudic scholarship. Title: More Talmudic Wisdom. Pretensions of wisdom by Talmudic Pharisee sages are perhaps the most incredible. No pompous dissertation seems complete without mention of privy. Sons of sages and scholars, we may read, may, quote, enter and sit down before their father, with their backs to the people, end quote. When, however, they do not possess the capability of understanding the discourses, they enter and sit down before their father, with their faces toward the public. If he went out to ease himself, he may re-enter and sit down in this place. This applies only to the minor functions of the body, but not to the major functions, since he should have examined himself before. A man should always make a habit of easing himself early in the morning and late in the evening, in order that there be no need for him to go far. End quote. Jewish Talmud remedies are foolish to say the least. The above passage from Horioth 13a through b of the Talmud is replete with learning such as the olive causes one to forget 70 years of study, so does olive oil restore 70 years of study. Wine and spices have made me wise. End quote. The Talmud sages then dispute whether dipping 1 or 2 fingers in salt makes one wise, whether passing under the bit of a camel or under the camel itself interferes most with mentality. The text then returns to the required protocol for the Nasi, head of the Sanhedrin, and the head of a Talmud school, the Abbeth Din, and how many rows have to rise in honor when each one enters. The Talmud also has wisdom about eating dates. They remove 3 things: evil thoughts, stress of the bowels, and abdominal trouble. This leads to a play on words, door, ladder, and bed, where, quote, one is fruitful and multiplies on it, end quote. Back to the old subjects. This is from Kethelboth 10b and 11a of the Talmud. On the same page is the Mishnah, the law, that a baby girl under 3 years and 1 day is always reckoned as a virgin. Quote, if they had intercourse before they were 3 years old and 1 day old, the hymen would grow. End quote.
Do not just the few illustrations above from the Pharisee Talmud show the justness of Christ's excoriations of the Pharisees, such as in Matthew 23:5-6, quote, full of all uncleanliness, and their love of the uppermost rooms at feasts, all their works they do for to be seen of men, and Matthew 27-8, quote, full of hypocrisy and antiquity.
And illustrating their hair-splitting paraded as wisdom, he called them fools and blind. Matthew 23:17-19. Title: Virginity on a Monetary Scale. The Kethuboth book of the Babylonian Talmud is supposed to set down rules relating to married life. The Kethuboth is a contract promising to pay a wife a certain sum of money if the husband divorces her, which he can do at will, according to the Talmudic doctrine. Perhaps urged on by the growing Christian propaganda against divorce, the Hillelite Jewish school stressed the husband's freedom to divorce his wife, even for some culinary deficiency, or, as Rabbi Aquba taught, because he had found a better-looking woman. The Ketubah need not be paid if the wife can be proven not to have been a virgin when married. Hence the Jewish custom of the groomsmen waiting outside the bridal chamber door for the bloody sheet to be witnessed, proving the wife's virginity. Elaborate cuts of these Kethuboth appear in the 1943 Universal Jewish Encyclopedia. Chicago physician and hospital owner Dr. A. Wamond, that's spelled W-H-A-M-O-N-D, Wamond, used to relate a member of my family about the money he made by putting in false catgut hymens for Jewish girls who were not virgins before they were to be married. The Talmud price for getting rid of a wife who had been a virgin is 200 zuz, zuz spelled Z-U-Z, given by the Universal Jewish Encyclopedia as being 200 denarii, or about $30. If the wife, this is in quotes, if the wife refuses sexual intercourse, she can be threatened with a reduction of her claims in the Kethaboth, and his threat can be carried out, end quote. If the husband can contend that the wife had not been a virgin, she gets only a mina, or the smallest coin, says the Talmud. All of this talk about blood and virginity is a favorite Talmudic subject, and seemingly endless. Note, for example, Exhibits 121 all the way through Exhibit 145. Herein, all from the book of Kethaboth. And, as always in the Talmud, the book of Kethaboth, Asininity, is combined with filth. For example, the controlling Mishnah, or overall rule in folio 61b, doles out by trades the proper number of relations between husband and wife. Quote, men of independence, every day, for laborers, twice a week, for ass drivers, once a week, for camel drivers, once in 30 days, for sailors, once in 6 months, end quote. Title: Sodomy Approved. Despite the thunderings and prohibitions of the Bible, sodomy in general, and specifically with little children, dead bodies, neighbors' wives, and one's own wife, is permitted by the Talmud. The argument for this last in Nedarim 20b of the Talmud, page 58 of the Sansano translation, quote, our sages said, a man may do whatever he pleases with his wife at intercourse. Meat, which comes from the abattoir, stockyards, may be eaten salted, roasted, cooked, or seethed. So with fish from the fishmonger, a woman came before Rab, R-A-B, Rab, and complained of her husband's sodomy with her. Rabbi replied, wherein does it differ from fish? End quote. All of this is made Jewish religious doctrine, with full Luciferian knowledge of the Bible's law against it. Quote, thou shalt not lie with mankind, end quote. And the biblical verse Leviticus 18:22 is actually cited in the same Talmud section where sodomy with boys under 9 or baby girls under 3 is permitted. The full text of this verse states, thou shalt not lie with mankind as with womankind. It is abomination. Small wonder that Christ denounced the Pharisees as nullifying the word of God and violating every concept of human decency. Title: The Talmud Today. After reciting the denunciations and condemnation of the Talmud down throughout the centuries, Rodkinson, in his introduction to the Talmud, states, quote, such was the past of the Talmud, which we hope will never be repeated. Now a glance at the end of the last century and the beginning of this one. The colleges for the study of the Talmud are increasing almost in every place where Israel dwells, especially in this country, where millions are gathered for the funds of the two great colleges, the Hebrew Union College of Cincinnati and the Jewish Theological Seminary of America in New York, in which the chief study is the Talmud and its post-Talmudical literature, end quote. This was written early in the present century. Is what Rodkinson wrote true today? The answer is yes. Not only are Hebrew Union College of Cincinnati and the Jewish Theological Seminary of America more active than ever, but a network of schools to teach the Talmud to young Jews now exists from coast to coast. For example, in the Chicago area, the Associated Talmud Torahs of Chicago oversee some 57 schools, where the Talmud is taught to young Jews, commencing with their tender years. If you are told by anyone that Jewish Talmud is merely ancient history concerning Judaism, do not be fooled. The Talmud is present-day Judaism, and without it, so-called Judaism would not exist. Okay, done with chapter 5. We're going to be moving on to chapter 6, hopefully tomorrow. And chapter 6 is on Judaism and it not being monotheistic. Thank you for listening, if you've made it this far.
הם חיות, הם בהמות, כתוב. כתוב, אתם קרואים מאודום ואין הם קרואים מאודום.
זהו, אבל לא הם בהמות.
נכון, לא כתוב שהם
אבל
בהמות.
יש לזה הסבר על זה, נכון? למה הם...
רגע, זה מה שאני רוצה להבין. רגע, שקט. אז מי, כן, מה כתוב? זה מה שאני לא מבין.
כתוב שאתם קרואים אדם, והגויים לא קרואים אדם, זה מה שכתוב.
לא קרואים?
לא קרואים אדם, לא קוראים להם אדם.
אוקיי, אז מה קוראים להם?
אדם זה הדמל העליון.
אדם הוא בן אדם שהוא שונה מהבהמה. אם הבן אדם עושה את מעשה הבהמה, אז הוא כמו הבהמה, מה זה שווה? כל בן אדם צריך לשלוט על עצמו. זה היהודים שולטים על עצמם. אם היצר אומר להם לעשות דבר והם לא עושים, אז הוא בן אדם.
אוקיי, ומישהו שהוא לא יהודי, אבל יש לו מישהו שהוא לא יהודי שעושה מה שצריך, הוא בן אדם או לא בן אדם?
כן, צריך לעשות דברים נורמליים, בדרך כלל הם עושים, הם יכולים להרוג אנשים שלא רואים אותם. יהודי לא יהרוג יהודי, אפילו שלא רואים אותם. אם אחד גוי, כן?
אבל יש יהודים שהורגים יהודים.
יש.
יגאל עמיר, רבי פופר.
יהודי שמתנהג כמו יהודי, ודאי יש יהודים שלא מתנהגים.
אוקיי, אבל רגע, מה שאני לא מבין, זה כל הגויים הם איך קוראים?
שנייה, אדוני.
בהמות.
אני יכול להגיד לך משהו?
אם אין להם ציווי.
אדם זה על שם הדמל העליון. אדם זה כביכול הדמל האלוקי. אוקיי? זה פירוש אדם. אנחנו הפכנו את זה, זאת אומרת העם הפך את זה, והאדם בן אדם, כמו אתה בן אדם, אתה צריך להתנהג כמו בן אדם. אבל בעיקרון זה על שם עליון. אדם זה הדמל העליון, וכיוון שאנחנו בנים של אלוקים, אז הוא קרא לנו בני אדם. ועכשיו, הגויים מה שאין, כן? אלוקים עשה אותם בשביל שיעשו פה...
בשביל לשרת את היהודים. כל הגויים שאתה רואה שיש בעולם, המיליארדים האלה, הם הכל רק בשביל שהיהודים יהיה להם איזה תועלת.
עכשיו,
אנחנו לא רואים את זה, אנחנו לא יודעים בדיוק.
שנייה, כן, היות ואנחנו בגלות, אז אוטומטי עדיין הם עוד לא משרתים אותנו לגמרי, רק חלקית.
כל אחד יהיה לו, כשמשיח יבוא, אז כל אחד יהיה לו אלפים עבדים, 2,800 עבדים.
בינתיים, המשיח לא כאן, אז איך הם משרתים אותנו?
הם בונים לנו רכבים,
בסדר, לא יודעים.
דירות, בניינים. למי הם בונים את זה? לנו. משרתים את היהודים.
אבל יש גם יהודים שעושים את זה.
בקושי.
בסדר, לא, בוא תשמע.